Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Velocity and how Tracker will plan your work for you so you don't have to. So Tracker's automatic iteration planning is really a key feature of Tracker, and it's one that can save you a lot of time by planning your iterations for you. And once you understand how it works, it can really save you a lot of time. So let's dig in. So I'm going to go into the project settings by clicking on More. And within your project settings, if you go down to iterations and velocity, you'll see the setting that I'm talking about. Down here, there is something called your velocity strategy. And what that does, it's set to the average of 3 iterations by default. But what that does is it tells Tracker how many of your previous iterations to look at when calculating what your velocity should be moving forward. So you are going to create your user stories. You're going to put an estimate on those user stories using the point scale that you will assign right here. By default, that point scale is the linear point scale that gives it a 0, 1, 2, or 3 point value. There are also powers of 2 or Fibonacci, or if you're used to another point scale, you can select custom and enter the values that you're more used to using. But I'm going to stick with linear. These story points are there to give you a roughly right versus precisely wrong estimate of a story. Story points do not represent time. They are there to represent the amount of effort or complexity that it's going to take us to finish a story, perhaps the amount of risk or uncertainty we have around getting a story done. But they're again not there to represent time, but we compare one story against another. And is this more or less work than another? Is it bigger or smaller? So you can really think of them as t-shirt sizes. Is this story a small, a 0, a medium, a 1, a large, an extra, a 2, or an extra large, which is our 3? Once we have our estimate on all of our stories, and I'm going to go back into my project. Once we have an estimate on all of our stories, we will put them in what's called a stack ranked order. What that means is we've just put them from most important at the top to least important down at the bottom. So again, we're just putting them in priority order. And Tracker is going to force us to make those decisions of what is most important to what is least important, because we can't have multiple things that are most important. So we'll have to kind of make those decisions. So let's actually go ahead and create a story and take a look at this. So I'm going to select Add Story, and I'm going to give my story a title. I'll save it, and then you'll see that we need to put a story estimate on this. Normally, we would do that in an iteration planning meeting or an IPM, and the team will discuss the story and make sure that everybody has a good understanding of what functionality it is that we need to deliver in order to complete this story. Do we all understand the acceptance criteria that we need to deliver? Once everybody says they've got a good understanding, we'll vote. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, go. And everybody can hold up the number of fingers that they think that this story should be estimated at. If we all think it's a 2, great, this story is a 2. If we disagree, then it just means we need to have further conversation. If one said it was a 0 or a 1, well, why did you think that? Maybe that person has information or thought of something that someone else did not. They thought of some code that we could reuse. They thought of something that we had done previously that is going to make this really easy to implement. And maybe the 3 says, oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to change my answer. I agree that this is a 0 or this is a 1. Or on the other end of the spectrum, maybe the 3 thought of something that makes the story more complex or higher risk. And they detail, well, I'm worried about this. And the person at the lower end says, oh, I didn't think about that. Ah, okay. I change my vote. This story is more complicated or has a higher risk or higher uncertainty than I was initially thinking. I change my vote. Maybe it should be at a higher story point value than I initially voted. Maybe at the end of the further conversation, we still disagree. That's okay too. And your team can have a working agreement that maybe if there's a disagreement, we're going to size it at the higher story point value and then we're going to move on. Or maybe we have an agreement that we're going to average them. If you think it's a 3, I think it's a 1, well, then maybe we should just size it as a 2 and then we'll move on. But we will create stories in Tracker, and as a team, we will estimate the stories so that we have a good understanding, again, a good feel for that t-shirt size of what estimate we should put on the stories. Tracker is then going to do the rest. So within Tracker, you will see that there are these iteration markers. And here Tracker is estimating for us how many stories we can do in any given iteration. And Tracker is going to make sure that we don't overburden our developers and plan too much work in any given iteration. And it does that by looking at that velocity strategy that we set in the project settings. And we told Tracker we want to look at the last 3 iterations. Again, that's the default setting. So when you average together an 11, a 9, and a 10, you get an average of 10. So up here in the upper left corner, you'll see that I have a 10. So that's where Tracker is getting that 10 from. That estimate there is coming from the average of my last 3 iterations because that's what I set in my project settings that I wanted Tracker to use. And then it's going to automatically plan for me my current iteration, iteration 4, and it's going to plan all of the work in my backlog. As I finish stories, Tracker is going to take all of that work, so we'll finish this story. And as we finish work, during this iteration, it just moves up to the top. But when this iteration finishes, you'll see an iteration 4 will get entered here. All of the done work will move over to the done panel automatically, but it won't move over until this iteration is done. If we didn't finish work, it will move down into the next iteration, and every iteration Tracker is going to recalculate that velocity and determine how much work we can do for what is now the current iteration, and it will replan that backlog for us again automatically. So all of that work gets handled. So that's a little bit on the velocity. You can make some changes to it. For example, there is a team strength setting. So if we have half of our team go away to a conference, we can change our team strength to be 50% because half of our team is gone. Tracker will then adjust and set our team strength for half of what it was, and then next iteration we'll be back at 100%. You can also go over 100%. So let's say that we have an intern who is going to be working with a team, or we've just picked up some additional resources, but for whatever reason, they're temporary. In that case, we can go over 100%, and now Tracker will allow for additional points for this iteration, but next iteration, again, it will go down. You can also change your iteration length and override that as well. So if for whatever reason we want to override the iteration length for just this particular one, we can make a change to it. So if I want this particular iteration to be 2 weeks instead of one, I can make that change. It will highlight it in gold to show that it's been changed. Just like over here, we can see that that's been changed as well. It will show the percentage that we have changed it to. So we can tell that we have made that change, and those are persistent changes. You can come over to this iteration and make a temporary change. This is not a change that will persist, but if we wanted to play with what if adding a new or additional resource would change our velocity, and we think that we could get a 12 or a 15 moving forward because we've added resources. This is a temporary setting. It is not one that will persist. It's not one that other users will see. But you could play with it temporarily and see what would happen to the current iteration in the backlog if you should make that change. But if I reload the page, you will see that that setting went back to 10. But these two settings are settings that will persist. So those are some changes that you can make that do impact your velocity if you need to override that for just a couple of iterations. So that's a little bit about how Tracker is calculating your velocity for you and how you can let it do all of the planning for you. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our other Tracker videos to learn even more.